I would be saying it. If you want to, you can also. No, it's okay.
Ça va être compliqué de faire la présentation en avançant sur un rouleau qui tourne. C'est bien, c'est qu'on est déjà en ligne, tout le monde entend. J'adore. Ça m'ira bien. C'est mon côté lion, plus que tigre. Oui, c'est bon. Tu veux dire bonjour? Bonsoir à toutes et à tous. Good evening, not evening, afternoon, but soon it will be the evening, of course. To everyone, thank you for being there in the FAO or with us through internet. Today we will have a seminar with Marion Claude. She is scientific member at the FAO since September 2022. She is a specialist of the region of Armim, and after a PhD thesis on a longue durée perspective from the Old Kingdom to the Roman times, she now focused mainly on the first millennium BC. I also want to introduce, of course, Kia Johnstone, who defended her PhD from Berkeley University in 2022. She also works on Armim, especially on Armim Scoffin from the 21st to the 30th dynasty. And she uses approaches from the field of digital humanities. She is currently in Cairo in the framework of an RC grant, and we thank her for being Marion's respondent today. And thank you to both of you for what will come.
Thank you, Maël, for the introduction. Is it working? And thank you, Kia, for being with us today and for coming. It's really a pleasure to have you here. And I can't wait for your input on what I'm going to say.
Thank you.
So I will share screen first, and I will be talking today about my upcoming research at the FAO, well, what I have started doing since this year at the FAO, which is a project indeed on the Armim area, and mostly on the prosopography and the onomastics of the people in this area. So I will get to that. I wanted to say also that it is, well, only the beginning of a project, so I will be talking mostly about questions of methodology and yes, ongoing problems and perspectives on this topic, and not yet about any results. Maybe this will come in the next few years, I hope. So let's start with prosopography, because this word is not so well known yet, and it's important to give a few details about it. So what is prosopography? I chose one of many definitions that can be found online. This one is by Catherine Keats Rohan, and she says, prosopography is about what the analysis of a sum of data about many individuals can tell us about the different types of connection between them, and hence about how they operated within and upon the institutions of their time. The social, political, legal, economic, or intellectual institutions, for example. So this means that prosopography is a way to study people for whom we know little, about whom we know little, meaning that the people in Egyptian society are very little known. We have very little data about each of them, about each individual. And so to study them, to know more about them, we cannot just study each and every one of them individually. we have to put them in a series, in a sequence, to find more information about them. And this is what I am trying to do in the Achmim area. So when you're starting a prosopography project, the three main thing to delimitate are who are the people you're dealing with, where are they located, and when did they live. If you have to focus on a specific group of persons which are united in some way. So this way can be the location where they lived. It can be the time when they lived. It can be what they did for a living. It can be many things, and it depends on what you want to study. So I will tell you a bit more about what is my the object of my study. So the area has already been mentioned a few times until now. It's the area of Achmim. This is, well, I chose this place because I studied it for my PhD, and it was a logical thing to work on this place more. So it's the capital city of the 9th Upper Egyptian province. Its ancient Egyptian names were Ipu or Khentinmin. So Ipu was the name of the divine area of the city, the temples of the city, and Khentinmin was more probably the name of the actual city where the inhabitants lived. And so this name of Khentinmin can be traced until now in the name Achmim, in the Arabic name Achmim of the city, through the Greek Chemis, and through the Coptic names also Shmin or Chmin, which gave then Achmim in Arabic. There is also an alternative name in Greek, which is Panospolis or Panonpolis, Panopolis in Latin, meaning the city of Pan, because the main divinity of the city of Achmim in ancient Egypt was Min, which was interpreted by the Greek as being the god Pan. So this is the place where the people I'm interested in lived. I've also been trying to focus on a specific period of time, not too specific, because one of my goals is to see the evolution throughout time of how those people lived. So I focus on a period that starts in the late period or even in the third intermediate period sometimes, which is the end of pharaonic rule, the last dynasties of Egyptian pharaohs, until the Roman time, which means that we switch from Egypt under Egyptian pharaohs, to Egypt under Ptolemaic rule, Hellenistic rule, to Egypt under Roman times. And it's a period of more or less, let's say a millennium, a little bit less maybe, during which you can see an evolution in society, let's say. So one of my goals is to see how this applies to the people I will be studying. And so who are these people? Because we have seen where they lived and when, but who were they? So the people you study depend on the sources you have about them. So the sources I have in Achmim are mostly the inscribed funerary material that has been found in the necropolises. So you can see here the town of Achmim. I have to show it like this. You can see here the town of Achmim, and the area where the people of Achmim were buried is here to the northeast of the city. In these necropolises, we have many information from the Old Kingdom, and then very little from the Middle Kingdom and New Kingdom. And we start having a lot of material from the late period or from the intermediate period onwards, which is why I have focused on this specific period of time, because we have many information about for these periods, and it's been very little studied until now. The funerary material that was excavated, and I will talk a little bit more about it later, is actually mostly belongs to priests. Most of the people who have inscriptions on their funerary material are priests, which is also why I am mostly studying priests and how they worked as a social group. because I don't have any information on other groups of people from the area, at least not in the funerary material. So the sources I am dealing with stem from the excavations led by Gaston Maspero between 1884 and 1886 mainly. It's continued a bit later until the end of the 19th century, but it's mainly during these 3 seasons that most of the material was excavated. Unfortunately, there is almost no archaeological record of the excavations that were led on this site, which means that we do not have, for example, the list of everything that was found in one tomb, and so on. And moreover, most of the material was dispersed throughout the world, because in that time, half of the antiquities that were found remained in Egypt, and half were kept by the excavators, either in Akhmim or in Cairo, and were sold to collectioners and to different museums throughout the world. So you can see this is a small map of where I have found objects from Akhmim. And so I have more than 600 objects from Akhmim at the moment, and coming from, I think, 180 collections. So it's been really dispersed throughout the world, and which is one of the reasons why it has not been really studied as a whole until now, because it's always very difficult to find them. And I think Kia can agree with me that it's always a challenge to find the material you want to work on. Which is also why it's nice to be able to talk, because we all have different materials.
Yeah.
So one of the first things I had to do, and I started with my PhD, was to gather all of this material in order to have a basis to work on. So what kind of sources do we have? What was the funerary material of the priests of Akhmim constituted of? Mostly stelae. You have here one example that is now in London. Also coffins, obviously. These are the 2 main types of funerary material you can find. You also have some offering tables, some papyri. There are less of them, but there are still a few. And also some statuettes of Tasoka Osiris, for example. So these are the main types of sources I deal with. There are a few other types, but mostly it's this. And on these sources are inscribed different texts. For example, here you have the text of one stela. And so the text on these objects are of 2 main types. On the one side, you have funerary formulae, for example, excerpts from the Book of the Dead and so on, which are destined to help the deceased in his afterlife. But you also have information about the deceased themselves and their family. And this is what I am most interested in. So let's see, for example, one of these texts, how it is composed. So it usually starts with a proskinema, that is to say an invocation to the funerary gods and also to the local gods of Akhmim, which is, by the way, one of the ways we know which divinities were celebrated in Akhmim. You have then an offering formula, that is to say all the things that were offered by the king to the gods in order to help the deceased in his afterlife. And then you have information about the deceased himself and their family. So this information is mostly titles and names and family relationships. So in this case, and I chose one with a lot of information, it is a very long line of information about the individuals that is given in this text, but it is not always the case. Here in this case, you have also a small funerary formula. You may also have other types of biographical elements. For example, I had this job for 10 years in the temple, then I moved to that job for 20 years and so on. That's when we are lucky. And you can also have, such as in this case, the name of the dedicant of the stela. So this is mostly the type of information you can find on these inscribed objects. For prosopography, what is useful is, of course, the name given to each individual. his titles, that is to say, an overview of his career, the family relationships, that he was the son of, the grandson of, and so on. And also sometimes, as I said, some other biographical information that are useful. And you also have the rest of his funerary material, the contents, both the formula he chose for his funerary material and also the materiality of the objects, and I will come back to that. So one of the aim of gathering this data is not just to accumulate these objects and the names and titles that are gathered on them, but to connect them together, which means that you have to identify, to link the objects together, to identify objects that belong either to the same person, to the same individual, or to members of his family. If you have an object with saying that X is the son of Y and the grandson of Z, you might find another object where you have Y who is the son of Z. So you can connect them together to build a family, to start building a family. In order to do so, you have to be very careful because it's always very difficult to find if someone who has the same name is the same person or not, because as in our days, you can have persons who have the same name as you do. So is it the same person or not? No, not necessarily. You can also have persons who have the same title, the same function, the same job as you do. And it's also the same, you have different persons behind one title or one function. So you have to deal with this uncertainty when trying to connect people together. And it's one of the main problems in building a prosopography is to find when you can be sure that two different persons are actually the same person, and when you are not, because you don't have enough information to make the connection. Which is also why studying not only the names and the titles and the family relationships is important, but also studying the materiality of the objects, because these texts are written on objects that also have an history, and adding the information from this history of the object, from this materiality of the object, to the data about the individuals and the titles is also very important, and this will be the theme of my case study just in a few minutes. So when you're reconstructing these families, building these links, these connections between different objects, you necessarily create family trees to show how they are linked. So I have tried to build family trees that can help check the validity of the data, the validity of the links when you look at them, because as I said, it's often very uncertain whether the connection can be made or not, and the more information in common there is between two objects, between two individuals, the more certain you are that they are indeed the same individual. So this has to be easily checked on a family tree. So I will show you what I have come up with. I hope it's clear enough. It's not a problem if you cannot read the names of the people. It's not what is important here. But what is important is how the different color lines run parallel. So you can see on this tree there are 50 different individuals that I have found on 14 different objects. I will show you just now these objects. So it's actually there are 6 stelae, 5 coffins, and 2 tomb reliefs, which does not make 14, but it's because a couple of the stelae are now lost. So I have only the text and not the photograph. If I place them back on the tree, you can see that all of these objects are actually linked together, that they belong to persons that are related together. And so it's not only the person that are related, but also the objects. And when you study the materiality of the object, it's very important also to build these trees. So what is important in the way I depict these trees is that each object is represented by the same color, a line of the same color. So for example, here the coffin of Neferrenpet is in red. And so on this coffin, we have the name of the owner, Neferrenpet, so she is underlined, and her father and her mother, Jedher and Aseteret. So these three persons are actually mentioned on her coffin. It's the same here for this coffin, for example. It's the light green color, and all the people connected by the light green color are mentioned with family links on the object here. Which means that when you have many different color lines running parallel, all of these people in this succession with these same familial links are depicted on different objects. Which means that the more the lines run parallel, the more certain the succession of generations in the family and the family relationships is. I hope that was clear. If not, you can ask me questions again later. So this is what I've tried to do to show how the different objects connect together, and to see where the reconstruction is sound and where it can be questioned. So yes, in this case, Nespakashuti, son of Jedher, well, let's say Horemheb, son of Jedher, son of Nespakashuti. This is written on at least 2 documents, and sometimes even on 4. So this is pretty sure. On the other side, the Jedher mentioned on the coffin of Neferrenpet is actually not very much linked to the rest of the family tree. So we can wonder if this coffin is indeed to be attached to this part of the family or not. And we will see that other things, when familial relationships, for example, titles and the materiality of objects, can help to ascertain the link or not. And indeed, the titles are also important. So I will go quickly through this because it's not the main focus of today, but it's also something I have been trying to do, is that when you have built a family tree, what is important is to study it. And one of the things you can study is how the titles were transmitted, for example, from father to son, from mother to daughter. And so I found that using this type of visualization, using colors to represent each title, is a nice way to see how titles can be transmitted or not. And you can see, for example, here that Pashiri Ira transmitted his titles to his son Jedaset UFR, for example. And there are also some titles that have been transmitted from Jedher here to Hornesut, to Jedher to Nesmin, but some others that have not. And then when you delve deeper into this study, you can try and wonder how this worked, if this was, if the fact that some persons had many titles and others had not that many was maybe because they had a longer career, or if they had a career of their own more advanced or something. And so this raises a lot of questions for study afterwards. But I will not deal longer with it today. So I move on now to a case study because this was very theoretical, and now I wanted to show you an example of how concretely you can deal with prosopography, and how the materiality of object is also very important in building a prosopography and in studying the material from Armim. And this is especially the part I will like the input of Kia, because it's exactly what she's been working on. So this is a coffin that is now in Prague, in the Abstract Museum. And I've been very lucky to be able to talk with Pavel Ondorka, who is the curator there, a few days ago, and to discuss this coffin with him. Because as you will see, depending on how you look at it, you can have very different interpretations of this coffin. very little studied until now, and what study has been done was using the coffin on its own. That is to say, just as a museum piece and not in connection with the rest of the Armim material. So the prosopographical information that is contained on this coffin is actually very scarce. It's the name of the owner of the coffin, which is Har, and the name of the father, Jed Asset Yoef Henri, who has two titles. One that is Semati Ipu, so stolist of Armim, and the other that is a scribe of the divine offering of Min. With this inscription, it's been noted that the owner was supposedly a male, because, as you may see, after the name, we have the sign of a male, a sitting male. You can see it maybe better in the transcription here. So this is a male sign. And then the word for the filiation, Za, means son. And it's really written like son and not like daughter, with a small stroke here and not with a T that would be the equivalent of a feminine. So apparently the owner of this coffin was a male, according to how the inscription is written. But we have a problem. First, the mummy inside is of a female. Well, this might not be a problem because, as we know, when coffins were sold, sometimes the sellers were putting pieces together and taking a nice mummy to fit into a nice coffin because it would sell more. So maybe we can think that the mummy did not belong with the coffin, so it's not a problem. The mummy is female, but the coffin was made for a male. The other thing that hints at a female owner, though, is the headdress on the coffin, because it is a vulture headdress, and this is only for females. So the coffin itself seems to hint both at a male and a female owner, which is apparently a problem. Therefore, it's been suggested that there was first a first owner, which was a male, which probably lived in the late period or early Ptolemaic period, and then a second female owner that reused the coffin a few generations later. And at this time, they would have added the vulture headdress as a decoration. Actually, Pavel Ondorka, the curator, told me that the yellow pigment used for the vulture headdress decoration is a bit lighter than the rest of the decoration of the coffin, which is also why he thought it was added later. But the name would not have been altered, and the inscription would have stayed the original inscription. But we will now see that when studying the prosopographical information, maybe there is a different interpretation. So forgetting now the appearance of the coffin for a while, let's focus on the names and titles. So the name Har is otherwise unknown. We don't have any other attestation of such a name written like this. So the name itself bears no indication if it is a male or female name. We cannot know from the name the gender of the owner. As for the father, his name Jed Asset Yoef Henri is rather uncommon in Armim. It's not something you find very frequently, which is actually very useful to try and find connections. As for his title, one of them, the Semati Ipu, stolist of Armim, is actually the most frequent title in Armim in the late period onwards. And it's written here in a way that is typical of the 26th dynasty, which is also a good hint for chronology. The other title is the scribe of the divine offerings of Min, and it's not a very frequent title this time. So it's also a very interesting starting point for a prosopographical study. We have at least two things that are not very common in Armim, and therefore, if we find other people bearing this name and this title, they might very well be from the same family. So that's what I did. I looked in my data, in the 600 and something objects I gathered, if I knew another Jeddah UF Henri, and if he was also a scribe of a divine offering of Min. And this is what I found. I found actually 2 coffins belonging to the same person, one that is in the Cairo Egyptian Museum in Tahrir, CG 41031, and another one that is in Copenhagen National Museum. So this coffin used to be put inside the larger one here. And now they are in 2 different locations. And if we look at what was written on this, who was the owner of these 2 coffins, this is what we find on the right side of the screen. So the 2 coffins belong to Nesmin here, who was the son of Jedher and the grandson of Hornesut. And his mother was named Her, or Her. We have 2 different orthographies on the 2 coffins. And she was the daughter of Jeddah UF Henri and granddaughter of Pasheri Aa. And we also have mother's side, which is very rare. And, well, you might remember that Jeddah UF Henri was indeed the name of the father on the Prague coffin, and that he had exactly the same 2 titles as the ones that are attested on the coffins of Nesmin in Cairo and Copenhagen. So considering that Jeddah UF Henri is not a very frequent name in Armim, and that the title in green is also very infrequent, you might wonder whether this Jeddah UF Henri is the same on all 3 coffins. What you might also notice is that the name Har here is also pretty close to the name Iher or Her on this one. Okay, so there's a few hints that maybe we have the same persons in all these documents. But in this case, Her is clearly a woman because she is the mother of Nesmin. And until now, I don't think it's been possible for a man to birth someone. So in this case, it is actually a woman. Well, maybe, maybe not, but are they indeed the same person? It seems so, but prosopography is maybe not enough to tell. So you have to look for further hints, further evidence on using the materiality of objects. And so this is where I've started to compare all 3 coffins. So this one is the one in Cairo and this one in Copenhagen. So they both belong to Nesmin. And this one is the one in Prague, so with the unknown owner. And what you might notice, for those of you who can read hieroglyphs, is that in the Cairo coffin, the determinative, also the sign after the name of the mother, is also the sign for a male. But afterwards, we do have the word daughter. Also the style, the ductus of the signs is pretty similar. I will come back to that. So maybe we do have a scribe who decided that it was okay to put a male determinative after a female name. Why not, after all? If we keep looking at the objects, the first thing we notice is that they seem pretty different at first sight. One of them is a black background with yellow and red decoration, and the other one is much more colorful with a yellow background and many colors on it. But at a second look, the layout of the 2 coffins is actually pretty similar. They both have striped hairdress, one with a vulture for female and the other without it for male. They have also a very wide collar on the chest. They have the same matte goddess depicted on both sides. Here there are a few more scenes on the coffin of Nesmin in Copenhagen that we don't have on the one in Prague. But apart from this, we also have the 4 sons of Horus, which are depicted on each side of the inscription on the legs, and so on. And also the jackals
on the feet, etc. So the layout is actually pretty similar with a few differences. But this is really not enough because these are also things you find on many coffins from Arnim. What was more interesting for me was a very small element, that is to say, this wavy line that can be found on the shoulder of both coffins, and that until now I have not found anywhere else. Kia will maybe contradict me, but at the moment, from what I have seen, this is the only two coffins where I saw this specific detail, which is for me one more hint as to their proximity. And as a matter of fact, you can also see that the falcon heads are pretty similar also, and they seem to have been drawn maybe by a similar hand. If you look also at the inscription, they are pretty similar. Well, as much from the point of view of the text itself, which is mostly parallel in all three coffins, but also from the writings, and especially from a few precise writings of some words, which are a bit, well, I don't know if mistaken is the right term, but let's say not the usual orthography of the word. For example, the name for fowl, aped, the birds, is usually written like this in the hieroglyphs. And here we have a writing which is more ipet, which was probably closer to the way it was actually pronounced at this time. And it's the same orthography on all three coffins. It's the same also for the word milk, elchet, who is written a bit erroneously ireret or irer, with a or instead of the ch, and also with a determinative that is different from the one you would expect, but which is the same in all three coffins. And I would have to check further in the Arnim material, but I think it's also pretty specific to this scribe. So in my opinion, all three coffins were decorated or at least inscribed by the same scribe, and possibly at the same time, because the text is also parallel in all three cases. Which means that for me, not only the prosopographical data is consistent, but also the relationship, the material relationship between the objects seems to hint at a proximity between the owners. Therefore, for me, there is little doubt now that this coffin was indeed made for a woman from the beginning, who was named Har or Hiher, depending on how you wrote her name, even though there is a mistake in the text. There is not really an evidence of reuse, because even though the vulture headdress is maybe a bit paler than the rest of the decoration, it's also very consistent with the style, and I don't think it was really added later. It seems to me that it's really part of the decoration. This individual now fits in a larger genealogical tree, the one I showed you at the beginning. And this shows that Har was actually the wife of someone who was a relative of a Theban vizier of Psamtik I, which means that if we reconstitute the time span of the family, she lived in the 26th dynasty, probably around 590 BC. And with this datation, I conclude this case study, and I enter another type of problem, which I will just touch about shortly, which is the problem of datation. And this is one of the problems I've been struggling with, is that dating the Arnim material is pretty difficult. You have usually two ways of dating material, either by absolute dating or by relative dating. In the case of Arnim, absolute dating is often very difficult to obtain, in part because no analysis has been, or little analysis has been done on the materials themselves, for example, C14 dating and so on. which would also raise a few other problems because wood could have been reused. So dating the wood does not mean that you necessarily date the object itself, and so on. Another type of datation or way to narrow down the datation that has been endeavored is stylistical analysis, which alone is clearly not enough to date objects precisely, because a style can have been in use for many years, even many centuries, and many different styles can have been in use at the same time. As we have seen, in fact, with the two coffins from Copenhagen and from Prague, from the mother and the son, they both look very different. So if you try to do just a statistical analysis, you may end up dating them, and this is what has been done, from two different periods, when actually they were probably made at the same time. Therefore, datation is quite a problem. And one of the things I would like to do by studying families and by studying the links between objects through prosopography is also to help narrow down the chronology of the ArcMIM material. Because when you identify connections between objects through prosopography, this leads to new relative datations between objects. For example, a stela and a coffin that belong to the same individual have probably been made more or less at the same time. On the contrary, a coffin that belongs to the grandfather of someone for whom we have another coffin can show us the evolution in coffins from one generation to the next and so on. Which means that prosopography can help to try and narrow down the dating of the material. This can then be combined with identifying workshops for the coffins, for the stelae and so on scribal hands, which will also provide links between objects that can be dated through prosopography and other objects that are as of yet not really linked to a specific period. And if you can cross-reference the prosopography and the identification of workshops, you may come to narrow down the datation and the chronology for the material. And for my own research projects, trying to identify a chronology and to narrow down the chronology is useful, because since I am trying to see how the priests as a social group evolved from the late period to the Roman period, it's important to know when they lived, and so to try and date them, which is why all of this is a bit imbricated in the ones with the others. Yes, so this was to exemplify the links between the objects, and so yes, to see that we can see a sequence that the owner of this coffin lived at this time, and there may be a difference that can be noticed either in style or in writing or in types of funerary formulae used and so on with previous generations and so on. Another problem, I touched upon it already, is the difficulty of being certain of the links between the individuals, which is what I call problems of homonymy and of paponymy, problems induced by paponymy. So homonymy is when two persons have the same name, and paponymy is a phenomenon in the naming patterns of individuals, which means that usually the eldest son is named after his paternal grandfather, which means that in a family, the grandfather and the grandson often have the same name, and so on. And since the titles are also passed through from generation to generation, sometimes you can have many people with the same name and the same title, and it's difficult to know if it's the grandson, the grandfather, or someone else completely. Which is why going step by step and trying to cross-reference the homonyms with the results
of previous prosopographical work and also the identification of workshops and so on will help to create links between possible homonyms and to refine these links. Yes, so here an example of paponymy. I don't know also if you can see it very well, but for example, you have a grandfather here whose name was Nespakashuti, and one of his grandsons is also Nespakashuti. And the father here, Jedher, who had 3 sons named Nespakashuti, Horem Saf, and Hernesut, all named one of their sons Jedher. So here we have Jedher, one of his grandsons is Jedher, the cousin is Jedher, and another cousin is Jedher. So all 3 men of the same generation were called Jedher. And then try to find who is who. So this is something you can find often. And if you follow, I don't know, this line, so this Jedher also gave his name to his grandson, who also gave his name to his grandson. So you have Jedher all over the place. Which I'm not fed up about it at all. Yes, and so just to wrap it up, a few words about the aims of doing all of this research about building families and so on. So the main aim is to go beyond what we know about each individual, to place them back inside their families so that we can then study and compare their titles, their careers, the transmission of the titles from one generation to another, how it works or doesn't work, the family relationships, how did you build your family, who did you marry, and so on. And also the naming patterns, as you could see, the fact that you name your grandson from his grandfather's name and so on. Does it work with other members of the family? Can we know more about these naming patterns and so on? And so using these families, the reconstruction of these families, will help me, I hope, to study priests as a group, how they functioned, how they lived together, how they lived also in relation to the rest of the society. Did you marry only other priests, or could you marry someone else, and so on. And also, when the chronology of these families is more certain, you can also look, for example, at what the clergy of Akhmim looked like at one precise point in time. So let's say, if I want to see in the 26th dynasty, all the people I know that lived in this time, who were they, what were their titles, can I build back the hierarchy of a temple using their titles and their relationships and so on. And so this is what I aim to do in the end. So the goal is not only to make nice family trees with lots of colors, but then to study them also and to try and create new knowledge about these people using this methodology. I don't know if I have time to go over just another aspect, which is onomastics, and to broaden a little. Yes, okay. So another thing I'm interested in and will be dealing with is more generally the onomastics, that is to say the names of these people. It's also very interesting to study because you can know more about the frequency of each name, whether they were very common in this place or not, if it's the same as in other places in Egypt, if it's names that are known throughout Egypt, or if it's very local names. And when it's very local, are they even sometimes just names that run in one family and not in others? Is it attested in just in a small moment of history, or is it really a name that you can find for a long period in this region or not? You can also see the evolution of these names, and sometimes if they have been reinterpreted. I've got one case like this, at least, when a name was not understood anymore and was reinterpreted according to how they heard it. And it sounded like something else, so they wrote it differently after some point because they didn't understand the original meaning anymore, and so on. And you also have all the Theophorus names, which can give you more information about the cults in the region, who were the divinities that were preferred in naming a child, and so on. And this I will be studying actually through the comparison of two different corpora.
On one side, the funerary material from Armim I have just talked to you about, which is mostly dating so from the Third Intermediate period to the Ptolemaic or early Roman times, which is a long time throughout which to consider the names of the people. And it will be also interesting to compare it with another type of sources, which is the Demotic ostraca from Atrebus. So Atrebus is a temple which is located in front of Armim on the other side of the Nile, and where many ostraca have been found since 2018. It's now more than 25 or 26,000, I think. So it's a huge mass of data, and many of them contain names of people. Probably not enough to really do prosopographical work as I can do in Armim, like building families. It's probably not enough information to do this, but at least we can study the names and in some cases some filiations and so on. And it would be interesting, I think, to compare how close or how different were the names between these two cities, Armim on the one side and Atrebus on the other side. So in Atrebus, the data is more difficult to date. The ostraca that have been found date from the 1st century BC to the 6th century AD. And for the Demotic, it's mostly from the 1st century BC to the 1st century AD. So it's a smaller time range because there's also ostraca in Coptic, in Greek, and in Arabic that have been found in Atrebus, which explains why some of them are dated as late as 600 AD. And yes, I would be very interested to compare both these corpora. So this is also one of the things I would like to do. I will not dwell further on this because it's a bit of an aparté, but this is also part of the work I will be doing here in the next few years. And with this, I thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you very much for that very informative speech, Marion. You convinced me. I am totally convinced that the coffin of Ihre is made by the same people as made the other two, the one in Copenhagen. Well, I'll open up the floor to discussion in just a moment. I had a few questions here. The first thing is I really, really liked the color coding on the genetic, on the family trees. That was a really good way to show it. Are you using any particular software to generate those?
Yeah, that's the question I usually get. And actually at the moment, I'm only using Excel, which is not so good, but I've tried a few genealogical softwares and none of them were really adapted to what I wanted to do.
Made for ancient people in their title.
Yeah. So if you know of anything that could deal with this, I would be very interested because it's really something that would be easier to do on something else than Excel.
Oh yeah, I was hoping you had an idea because I would like to know too.
Maybe we can try and develop one.
Yeah, exactly. That would be fun.
Yeah.
What kind of changes do you expect to see in the priesthoods?
Well, actually, I have not really an idea yet, but what I would like to know is whether for one thing, whether the clergy of the temples evolved, if some titles were the same for the period or not, if they changed, if maybe we can also link them to what we know, for example, of hierarchy in the temple through the Greek sources and the Greek titles, because we have also information about the hierarchy of the temples through the administrative side, actually, of the temples. And is this different from what happened earlier, when before the Greek rule over Egypt and so on? And yes, if we can see some reforms in the clergy for time. This is for the part with mostly with the titles. And also, what I'm wondering about is, well, we know that the more the time passed, the more the priests were really a group more or less closed on themselves, because to be a priest, you had to be son of a priest and of a priestess, or at least of a woman who came from a priestly family, which means that you really had to marry among priests if you wanted to keep the priesthood. And priesthood meant money, which was very important. And was this already the case in the late period or not? And so it's evolutions like this that I would like to see if I can trace or not. And maybe many other things I have not thought about yet.
That is really interesting. I did not know that it changed like that in the Ptolemaic period to where it was kind of an enclosed system. Do you find any administrative titles at all?
Not that many, actually.
Okay, I haven't seen many either.
Yes. So apart from a few scribes, most of the titles are really religious. And this is also one of the questions I wonder about, because maybe something that can be answered also by studying the demotic sources and so on, is do we find the same titles in the demotic sources and in the hieroglyphic sources? Because I have a feeling that it's when you write in hieroglyphs, you write also to the gods, to the divinities, and in a divine writing, which means that you don't say the same thing as you would say, for example, in a contract. You will not describe yourself in the same way because it's not for the same purpose. Yeah. And unfortunately, we have very little demotic contracts, for example, from the Akhmim area, or at least that have been published yet. And also very little bilingual inscriptions. We have a few, but not that many. And in the demotic inscriptions, often the titles are not cited, which means that it was not what was very important for the day-to-day life.
Fair enough. So the other question I had, and this is something that has puzzled me a lot, is there's a lot of assumptions in some of the literature, especially dealing with the Third Intermediate period, that places outside of Thebes were kind of subordinate to Thebes. This has been said especially about Abydos. And I'm wondering, are there people from Akhmim who have Theban titles or who have titles in other cities?
There are a couple of them, but not that many, actually. Most of them have titles only from Akhmim. A few of them have also titles in Thebes or in Coptos or in a few other areas of Upper Egypt, but really not that many. I would need also to check when these people lived, as far as I know. But I think the ones who are not only from Akhmim were mostly from the late period.
Okay. And along those lines, you talked about, I think, Nezpa Kashuti, the vizier. And so these guys can trace their family back to him.
Yes, exactly. So maybe one I showed you today is actually quite specific in the Akhmim landscape, because it's one of the only ones we can really date, since they are indeed a branch from a Theban family. So I don't know if I can go back to... let's say this tree. So the Jedher that is here is the one that moved to Akhmim, and his father was a vizier, probably under Psammetichus I, and we know other relatives that are in Thebes, still in Thebes, when these people lived. But this one moved to Akhmim. I have no idea why. And he had many descendants in this city. And thanks to them wanting to be seen as descendants of a vizier, they've all written their genealogy on their stelae and on their coffins, and so we can pretty well date them. And this is a good starting point for my research, because it's one of the only ones that can be dated through someone we know from the great history with a great age.
Awesome. Yeah, that's really quite cool that his ancestors claimed him, because I did not know of anybody who claimed him as their ancestor. So that's cool. Well, I'm going to open up the floor in just a second, but I do have a few more questions here, if you don't mind, everybody. So what criteria are you using to determine whether a piece is from Akhmim or not?
Well, what I've been doing until now mostly is using the text. actually, because I'm more interested in the people who lived from Akhmim than necessarily on people who had their material made in Akhmim. But when you start with this, you necessarily see a few hints and bits and pieces of very specific text, decoration, and so on that can be traced back to Akhmim, and then you can find them on other objects also. But this is more your domain than mine, I think.
All right. Yeah, I ran into problems with, because everything was dispersed on the art market, it was hard to figure out which people actually came from Akhmim.
Yeah, and actually on this topic, the date when the pieces arrived in the museum or in the collection is also sometimes a good hint, because if it's after 1884, in the few years after that, there's a good chance that it came from the site. If it's earlier, it's more problematic.
Yeah, because not a whole lot of stuff left to the site before the 1880s when Maspero did his excavations.
Yes.
Yes. That is about all I have. I would like to open it up to questions for further people.
Thank you. It was very interesting. I really like the prosopography discussion because this is also what I do. How plundered was the site before Maspero came?
It's difficult to say, but it was in an area that had not seen much interest before, so it was probably not that plundered, apart from, well, plunders maybe from antiquity already and so on, and some tombs that were open in the mountain that were used, for example, by Coptic eremites and so on. But actually, the part where the Ptolemaic and late period Ptolemaic and Roman tombs mostly were is a small hill. I will go back to the map at the beginning also. And since it's a hill and with with tombs that were carved going down inside the ground and not shafts. Sorry, it was mostly preserved, I think. Which the ones that were more open and more plundered were the ones in the cliffs, which were with the facades that were visible from the area, and that were more easily plundered. But the shafts, I think, were mostly preserved. I don't know what you think, Kia.
Yeah, I think it was pretty, there wasn't a lot of stuff. Oh, well, thank you, I can be loud. There was not a lot of stuff coming out of the site, I don't think, before the 1880s. There are a few objects, but not much at all.
And I think most of the objects that are supposedly from Akhmim from before 1884 are actually from Abydos or from other sites. So I don't think there was really plundering in the years before 1884, and whatever was plundered was much earlier. Any other question? Another one.
Here.
It's regarding the paponymy. First of all, I'd never heard that term. It's awesome. Is it seen elsewhere? Is it very specific to the Third Intermediate Period? Is it seen earlier? This tendency of having...
Yeah, so actually it comes from papos, which means grandfather in Greek. So this is the origin of a term. And I think it's pretty frequent in the later periods. I wouldn't know exactly when it started, actually. But I know that it was also very frequent, for example, in Europe, even in the modern period and so on. Because for having done a bit of genealogy on my own family, in many cases, you can see that the names are also kept in the family. Well, the phenomenon is a bit different because it's often the godfather who gives the name to the child or the godmother, but you have also a transmission like this and some patterns, at least, maybe not from grandfather to grandson, but some patterns like that. And actually, in modern Europe, often the godfather of the first male child was his surviving grandfather, if he had one. So it's also how it went through. So, well, naming patterns are something that is very common. Paponymy in itself, as a rule, is maybe a bit, well, even a rule is maybe a bit too much to say, but it's been observed quite a lot in the late period and onwards. But I wouldn't know when it started exactly. Actually, I think there's a lot to do on naming patterns in ancient Egypt.
So does anybody else have any questions?
I have one.
Okay.
It's quite a new subject for me, so maybe the question is stupid, but I really need to ask you, why did they put so many names on the object? And is it always the name from the same family, or are there some places or objects where you have different families in the same object, or this kind of thing? Okay. But the most important for me is why, really.
I'm not sure I have an answer, yet an answer to that. But as for the why, one of the questions I'm asking, and which is also, let's start another way. This thing of giving your genealogy throughout many generations appears actually rather late in ancient Egypt, in the Third Intermediate period, or a bit later, early late period. Some Egyptologists have said that it actually stems from the Libyans, because it appears at the time the Libyans come to Egypt, and that it was a tradition for the Libyans to designate themselves by their forefathers. Others have said that it's probably not the case, for many reasons. One of them being it's difficult to keep tabs of your forefathers when you don't have writing and so on. I'm not sure about that either, but I'm just telling you what has been said. I knew you would not agree with that.
You can remember more than 14 generations, it's not a problem. Oral transmission is much better, in fact, because you never lose it, except when you lose all the people.
Yes.
A text, you lose it really easily. So
yes. That's also what I think, but I'm not sure either that it's necessarily from the Libyans that came this tradition. It's also possibly related to the fact that at this period in time also the transmission of titles and functions was more and more set inside the family. So it was also a way to tell that you had this function or this job because your father had it and your grandfather had it and so on. All the more so as you can, as in the case of this family, link yourself back to very important people, which is always a plus in the social network and so on. So I don't have an answer exactly as to why, but I think it's connected to some social developments at this period in time. If you have any ideas, I'd be interested to hear them.
Thank you very much. I thought about the Libyans, of course. I also think about something. Maybe it's just a random thing, but during the whole first millennium BC, we have no sites from nomadic people in the desert. No more, not any site except from the beginning of the Ptolemaic period. Before that, we have nothing. So maybe this could be linked not only with the Libyans, but with sedentarization of some people from the desert, because it's a nomadic tradition. It's really a nomadic tradition, and this was why I asked you this question.
And so you think this would have had an impact in the whole of Egyptian society, that we would have adopted this system? Why?
Why not?
This is my turn to ask.
Why not? Why not?
Yes, why not? But why?
I just think that we have to discuss it more,
yes.
but it's. It struck me because you just told us that it starts late and it starts at a time where nomadic people seems not to be in the desert.
Yeah,
So-
and before that, in ancient Egypt, it was mostly relationships on the same, brothers, cousins, sons and daughters, and the living family, actually, or the family you would have known, which is depicted in the tombs and the stelae and so on. And starting from, this period, you really have the patrilineal tradition that is given. And sometimes a bit of a matrilineal line also, but only when, I think only or mostly when it links to someone important on the father's mother's side.
And do you have
Mother's father's
sometimes only matrilinear or never?
Not in Achmim, at least. I wouldn't say for other places, but not in Achmim.
Because it's also something to check for this kind of question.
No, I have not looked in other places, so I have not heard of it, but maybe it's just that I don't know about it.
So thank you very much. Ready?
I've stared at a few Theban coffins too, and it's usually the father's family. Yeah, I can think of one case where it's the husband's family, but it's usually its father.
Usually males.
Yeah, it's usually men. Oh, okay.
Thank you, Marion, very much for your interesting talk. I just would like to have a question in relation to the coffins which we do have from Achmim with human remains or mummies. So especially I have seen that you had some connections between some coffins here and there. So can we reach to an outcome through the study of the human remains of different people from Achmim? This is number one. Number two, in relation to the continuity of a family tree from a generation to a generation, can we reach to the outcome that the continuity of this family or that is based on religious power? For example, their link to the god men, so they guarantee their continuity. So I inherit the job of my father and my forefather. So I mean, you find that as long as you are attached to the temple or the god men, so you find that, I mean, you have a sort of power. You are elite, you can have, for example, you can afford having a coffin, different material. So if you afford to have a material, inscribed material, you afford you guarantee your continuity. So thank you very much.
Thank you for your question, Ahmed. As for the first one, I will take this with me because I want to look at you when I answer. As for the human remains, at the moment, I don't think there has been any study that has been done on DNA, for example. I know that there is Jonathan Elias in the United States who is dealing with mummies and so on and having CT scans and trying to also to establish links between them. But I don't think DNA has been done yet. This would be something interesting also to link some pieces together with the caveat that, as I said, sometimes the mummy that is in a coffin is not the mummy belonging to this coffin. So you can have results when the results are positive and or concordant with what you find with other sources. But sometimes maybe you will have no results just because the mummy is not the right one. And for the other questions, yes, it's also something I've been wondering, because indeed for the material from Achmim, most of it, not all, but most of it belongs to priests. And when there are titles, it's almost always have no titles. So they may be just other members of the elite that were not priests. But when titles do exist, it's usually titles of priests. So it does say something about who could afford a coffin and what these inscribed coffins were used for, and that it was indeed a marker of some status in the society. And I would like to know more also about the other ones, but at the moment I don't really have much data on them.
Yes, so thank you everybody for this session. It was really nice. Thank you Kia and Marion for your work. Thank you everybody for your attendance and your question. And see you next month for another IFAO seminar. And see you soon.